Welcome to Students Over Systems, where we talk with the creators, advocates, and beneficiaries of education freedom. I'm your host, Jenny Gentles. On today's episode, we're going to talk about designing and implementing school choice programs that serve parents and students well. For this important discussion, we're joined by Whitney Marsh, who is the Director of Policy Operations at Yes Every Kid. Whitney has had every cool job in education policy over the years. She's served as the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Superintendent of Public Instruction in Arizona, the Executive Director of the Arizona State Board for Charter Schools, and she also held key positions with the Arizona Governor, the Arizona Board of Regents, the Chamber of Commerce, and Governor Jeb Bush's organization, Excel in Ed. Whitney, your career is so cool, and I'm so excited that you're talking with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We tend at the Students Over Systems podcast to delve kind of straight into policy wonkism. And I want to pull back today because I think you and I will definitely have the opportunity to do that, and start with a story or a family that's really inspired you to do what you do with education freedom and expanding options for families. And that could be like a charter school or an ESA family, a homeschool family. Do you have an example of somebody who's really inspired you?
Yeah, so I would say, just starting off, I got into education policy very young. I was 18, a freshman in college, and decided I wanted to go into education policy because I recognized that education was the path to mobility for me, for my family. My parents were in high school when they had me. So I went into this education reform space at its peak time, right? Like 2005. I was in grad school in 2009 through 2011 during Race to the Top. But what has really evangelized me for education freedom is experience that I've had administering these programs in the state, and then dealing directly with families as we were potentially restricting their access to options that were a lifeline to them. So whether it was at the charter board, when we attempted to close down schools and saw families come in and protest that school was saving their child, or more recently at the Department of Education administering ESA, there really is this sense that we can fall into as educators and education reformers, that we are saving people, and it's not right. They can save themselves if we just get out of the way. And so working on ESA, my first few weeks in the Department of Education, there was a lawsuit, and then families came in, and I remember this one particular mom saying, if the public school worked for us, that's what we would have done. We wanted to send our third kid to the same school that our older kids are going to, that's down the street that they could walk to, but it did not work for my kid. And we've been through the ringer. And now to get here where we see this amazing program that's giving us an opportunity that we feel is, like I said, a lifeline for our child. And now you're getting in the way because I don't have the right paperwork or the right credential to prove or validate or justify my choice. And that's where it really clicked for me. Like, wow, we don't know actually what's best for every single kid. And the reason these programs exist is to allow for families to make the choice based on what they know their child needs. And we just need to get out of the way.
I love that. And also, Whitney, I started young with my education reform or school choice journey, and I subscribed early on to Jeannie Allen's Center for Education Reform newsletter back when it was like mailed to people. So I'm a full supporter of getting started young. If you feel passionate about making sure that families have options, there's a whole community out there ready to link arms with you. All right, so you mentioned working at the Arizona Department of Education, but you also worked for the Arizona governor, I believe. And we talk a lot about what governors can do with education. I've interviewed three former governors here on Students Over Systems. And we talk a lot about how governors are competitive people. So I like to share the stories of the good news of what governors have done when it comes to K-12 education and expanding education freedom. What sort of things were you able to accomplish when you were in that role?
Yeah, so it was my first job out of grad school. I was the budget analyst for Governor Brewer, the Office of Strategic Planning and Budgeting. And it was right after the Great Recession had just destroyed revenue to the state.
Mm.
So Governor Brewer had championed Prop 123, which was a temporary sales tax to help hold harmless to some extent the public schools. That there was $1 billion deficit in the state at the time. At the same time, they passed ESAs, the first ESA program in the state of Arizona. And so working in the budget office, I had to get to know how these systems work. How does school finance system work? How do you write a formula for an ESA program that makes it more sticky and durable and, manage the fiscal impact and all of those things. But I think from that moment, being in the governor's office and some of the other reforms that she did that weren't education related, but absolutely then allowed for things to happen in education by protecting state fund or expanding programs, saw right away that if you don't have a strong executive that's a champion of the program, it is really difficult, if not impossible, to get some of these great policies passed.
Yeah, they have to have that great executive, and then also their team needs to be on board, right? I remember when I worked at the Florida Department of Education, I was leading the school choice office there, and I would get really nervous when I saw a call coming in from the governor's office because they were making sure that we were being held accountable to the governor's vision. Like you needed to explain yourself if you weren't, and that leadership and that little bit of fear in there and that team holding you accountable, I think is all part of the package leading to success. All right, leaping. There's so many jobs that you've had that are so
I call it my PhD. I've been trying to figure out how to make these policies work by getting inside of all of the organizations that are responsible for writing them and passing them and implementing them.
And I recommend that to others as well, because we can have a theory of how a policy should work. But if you're on the inside, you know kind of what you're up against when it comes to the education bureaucracy or other aspects of a government bureaucracy. And kind of what is a pro-parent policy and what is a pro-government policy. So you definitely have that perspective all around. Before we delve further into education savings accounts and what's going on in Arizona now and what your recommendations are, let's look at Arizona charter schools, which again is another role that you've had. You were in a leadership role at the Arizona State Board for Charter Schools, which is a huge independent state authorizer. That means they oversee the charter schools in the state of Arizona. How, in your experience, how did you find the charter sector in Arizona? Is it significantly different from residentially assigned public schools?
I would say yes. I mean, just by nature. And we learned a lot during COVID about the difference between charter schools and residentially assigned schools, in that families have to opt in. They live or die by enrollment. There is no one assigned or forced or mandated to enroll in their school. And so they really serve families and the needs of the families and students in order to achieve that enrollment. They operate in a market. It's oftentimes in Arizona, we say it's the Wild West. I think I wear that proud, that badge proud, because really, the more restrictions you put in place, we found the more we tried to prevent bad actors, we actually were hampering growth of the highest performing schools that were serving the most students and the most diverse population of students. And so what I think, getting back to your question, what's different is that their customer is families. And so they are always thinking about how to better serve the families and students that are attending their school, because if they don't, they leave. And we see that schools close. And a lot of times we see those, that data, the number of school closures, charter school closures used against the sector. And we always say that means it's working. They're serving a need for a time. And if families no longer want to use that option, then they close. That's a feature, not a bug.
How many charter schools are there in Arizona now?
I'm not going to remember the exact. Oh, well, I don't know the exact number right now. It's been a while since I looked, but it's around 550 charter schools that are operated under like 420 or so contracts with the state. And so it's a little over 20% of total public school enrollment is within the charter schools in Arizona.
I think I was just interested in that, like how many hundreds, because I'm living in Virginia where there's like five. Literally. Literally. And people don't realize in Virginia how far behind we are other states. So I always like to point out how many hundreds California has, and Arizona and Florida and many other states. I'd say it's comical, but it's also tragic how few options we have here. All right. So currently you work with an organization called Yes Every Kid, an organization with an interesting period or two interesting periods.
Lots of periods. Yeah. Yes.
Periods.
Foundation period. Yes.
Yeah. So yes, every kid with I read somewhere the goal of unlocking the extraordinary potential of every kid, which is the title of our episode here. Tell us a little bit about the mission of the organization.
Mm-hmm. I think Yes Every Kid and then Yes Every Kid Foundation, which I work for the foundation side, we truly believe that to best serve the needs of families and students, you have to source bottom-up solutions. So it's the people who are closest to the students that know what's best for them, and that we need to trust them and then empower them to make the decisions based on their kids. And it's not going to be the same all the time. It's not going to be the same every year for every kid. It's not going to be the same for all of your kids. If you have multiple kids, I have 3. So I know this, what works for one of them isn't always going to work for that child. She was in one type of school. She's no longer in that type of school. Served as well then. You need flexibility to move in and out of different options based on where your kid is at the time being, where your family is at. Sometimes the convenience factor is the most important. We don't believe that we know at the top what the right answer is for everybody. So we're working through policy, and then on the foundation side, following up with defense and culture and strategy and implementation support to the agencies and vendors that are implementing these programs, that we really want to focus on family first and how these policies serve families first and truly empower and trust families to make those decisions. And so I think, what's different is that we really believe in people and believe that they will make the right choice for themselves, even if it's not the same choice we would make for them.
So as I mentioned, I started this school choice journey, education reform journey a long time ago. And there were kind of 2 paths. You could advocate for charter schools, which are public alternatives to residentially assigned public schools, or you could advocate for scholarship programs or what was called voucher programs. I get the impression Yes Every Kid isn't falling into a particular camp. Is that right?
No, we are yes. Yes, and yes, every kid. Yes, all of the options. We want all the options. Open enrollment is another option. Removing boundaries that really restrict families to where they can send their kids to school based on income, right? It's de facto segregation based on income. So no, there's not a particular education freedom policy that we support over another. We want the most freedom. So some policies offer more than others, and we would take those over alternatives, but we are definitely a yes and organization.
Okay, so let's talk about that open enrollment a little bit. So we've talked about private school options, charter school options. We've alluded to education savings accounts. Open enrollment kind of seems like the first thing we should have started with long ago. But there's a lot of resistance to that. So the idea is that these residentially assigned schools with school boundaries defined by the district, that kind of fades away, and that parents can choose to send their child to a school outside of their school boundary. I can imagine in an area where I live, which is Northern Virginia, Arlington County specifically, when parents spend an obscene amount on a house because in large part of a school district and a school boundary, they might be really resistant to this idea of open enrollment. How would you all respond to people who are opposed because they're concerned about how it might impact their mortgages?
Mhm. How it might impact their mortgages or how it might impact their schools.
I guess not so much their like the finding. I think that a lot of the resistance that the organizations that are advocating for this big open enrollment push are going to find are going to be from my neighbors who, and maybe mortgage isn't the right word, it's the value of their home.
Yeah, or their tax bills if they're having to cover the cost of more students that aren't taxpayers in their community. Yeah, we hear these.
Or their local school isn't good anymore because it's not just the students in that district. They're students from everywhere. Oh no, that's the concern.
I mean, the fact that that conversation is had publicly is offensive, right? Like we are saying, oh, it's fine. We want you to have choice, but not our choice. Like this, we paid for. It's exclusive. It's elite. We want to keep people out. That doesn't work. That doesn't sit well with me. I don't think it sits well with families or with constituents. And so I think it really, the root of the problem here, right, is how we fund schools. The fact that schools are funded based on outdated formulas that rely on property wealth to fund schools. And as we see in places like Arizona that have had open enrollment for decades now, it was the first education freedom policy passed in Arizona. We see that actually families are more likely to use open enrollment within their district and intra-district than they are to use other school choice options like the ESA or tax credit scholarships or charter schools. Families do choose their public schools. They like their public schools, but maybe not the one they're assigned to. They want a different one because it offers different programs. And so I think as we see in places like Arizona, where there is more choice and people get used to the idea that you have options, that you're going to choose, that you are a consumer in this market, that funding mechanism no longer makes sense. And we need to move away from it, right? Like we need to untie school funding and school assignments and mandates from where you live, which often is tied to other things like income, right? So I'm not sure I'm totally answering your question, mostly because I hate those talking points. They do offend me and make me very uncomfortable. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I came from, my parents had me when I was when they were in high school, and we're not married, and we moved a lot. And my mom was always trying to find, like, oh, we moved from one apartment complex to another because she heard that school was better. And so, but that's very hard to do. And so giving families access not only to the school and the public resources in that school and the opportunities that come with attending a different school, but also making sure that they can get there through transportation and other ways that we're enabling access for all kids.
Oh, that's a podcast conversation for another day. Once again, Arizona, the Wild West of education freedom, is ahead of the rest of us on tackling that tricky transportation issue. Okay, yes, every kid, celebrating and unlocking the extraordinary potential of every kid, but also supporting edupreneurs, the people, the providers who are expanding options for kids. So what is an edupreneur and how are you all working with them?
Ooh, I hope I get this definition right. I might not use the word for word definition that our legal defense team uses. But essentially, it's anyone who's going out and offering an education service to families and students. So you could be doing this as a sole proprietor offering tutoring services to your neighborhood families. You could be launching a micro school, starting a private school, starting a charter school, right? So it's entrepreneurs that are starting businesses, regardless of scale, that are serving families and students in their education journey.
And then how are you all supporting them as an organization?
Yeah, so we have our legal defense team is run by Mike Donnelly, and Essentially, they're working as a resource to education entrepreneurs that need help navigating the very complicated regulations and laws that relate to starting schools and serving students. So, in a lot of states, if you are going to be convening children together in a space for childcare, daycare, learning opportunities, you're going to fall under various parts of regulation in the state. You're going to have facilities and health and safety, and then maybe accrediting or certification requirements for teachers, background checks, all of these things that fall. It's very complicated in addition to having to actually launch a business and serve families. It's a lot for new education entrepreneurs to navigate. And so, what Mike's team is building out is a capability that can serve them in their need in the moment pro bono. So, you reach out, you're having an issue, say maybe you're trying to open a micro school in Florida, and you're not sure if the number of kids you have and the space you have is going to need the sprinklers, right? Health, fire, life safety stuff, the sprinklers. And so they can help answer those questions for education entrepreneurs and then give them support resources to help support them ongoing.
That's amazing. I so admire the people who are doing this because it's so much to take on. And thank goodness they've got support out there to make sure that they navigate these systems and can focus on serving the kids, which is what probably is their big motivation, right?
It's so important to point out here too that most of these education entrepreneurs are coming from the classroom. They're coming straight from public schools. They're teachers, right? And they are problem solvers and they are entrepreneurial just in the way that they operate already. And so they see a need and they're going out and scrappy, doing everything they can to try to create an option to serve that need, to serve their community. So it is great work. And I'm really proud to be a part of a team that is doing that work.
Let us transition to education savings accounts as we wrap up our conversation. I was going to ask you what your ideal education freedom model is, in your opinion. We've been talking about all these different ones. Am I right in assuming that it's ESAs, or are you more ecumenical?
No, I don't. I actually don't think it would be ESAs. I think the general spirit of the ESA law, I would say yes, empowering families, giving them the resources that they have a right to for their public education, to choose options that work for them. Yes, totally believe in that. When it comes down to implementation, we really want to see policies that, put our money where our mouth is, so to speak, and do trust families and empower families to make the best choices for themselves. And so eliminating the middleman as much as possible, the middleman being often the government in deciding how you can spend that money, where you can spend it. And so I think the closer we can get to giving the resources directly to families, and that being the only engagement between the state and the families, and then the families have access to a marketplace that already exists, right? Mm-hmm. These options are out there and they're growing. If they have the resources, they should be able to go access the programs and services and schools that they want without intervention from the government.
Well, I certainly understand having some concerns about ESA or education savings account programs when it claims that it's going to be this flexible funding account for families, but then what it is funding that you can use for state accredited private school tuition. It's like, well, wait a minute. That's not really a flexible funding account. And I'm looking at you, Iowa, as an example. Great that they passed a school choice program that's university eligible, but let's make it wildly flexible as well. For a while, we were calling Arizona the gold standard when it came to ESA programs, but now I have questions because you did issue a report recently called Reimagining Arizona's ESA Program, Empowering Parents and Ensuring Accountability. What needs to be reimagined there? This
Mhm.
is the gold standard, right?
Yes, I would still say the policy is the gold standard. It is the most free. You can use it for the most, services and goods than you can in any other place. I would say the challenge is in implementation. And again, while these laws in Arizona, it's got empowerment in the name, right? Empowering parents. There is we are compelled as stewards of taxpayer dollars to make sure that money is only being spent on lawful purposes. But that has been the only way we define accountability for these programs.
Mm-hmm.
And as an insider in the Department of Ed, I saw that just doesn't work. And that's not how we hold other public programs accountable. We want to know, are you getting as many eligible families as possible signed up for the program? I mean, we do this in Medicaid, in SNAP. Is the state identifying who's eligible and making sure they have the information about the program and are signing them up? We want to make sure that it's easy to access. So, is the application available throughout the year? Because I might not just need it in March when the application window is open. There might be something that happens in October. I mean, I know a friend of mine, something happens at a school in October and they need to move in October. They need to be able to access the program. How difficult is it to apply for the program? Are you requiring me to upload all sorts of documents that, oh, by the way, the government gave me originally to prove or validate that I'm eligible? That is a barrier to entry. And we're adding all of these layers
Mm-hmm.
of bureaucracy, really, that prevent the very families we're trying to give access to the program. It prevents them from accessing it. And so that report that we partnered with Common Sense Institute Arizona on is really to say, look at all these other public programs. The policymakers and the public take a risk on those programs. They say, we know there's going to be misuse, there may even be fraud, but we are not going to solely design this program to prevent that, because then it restricts access and limits the beneficiaries of the program. So it's a balance. And so what we're saying is that all the focus has been on how are people spending the money, which, by the way, is a new way of doing business in education. There's a lot of gray areas, right? So a lot of this fraud that's talked about, it's not fraud. I thought that was approved. I wasn't sure. I asked and someone approved it. And now you're saying it's not approved. That's very different. So we're just asking that we look at this program, and it's growing pains, right? It's new. It's a totally new way of doing education funding for the state departments of education. They're working directly with families for the very first time. They're typically working with systems, right, with school districts and charter schools. And so we think we just want to keep pushing them to say, like, yes, we do want to protect taxpayer dollars, but not at the expense of the program being easy to sign up for, easy to use, and meeting family demands. That's why we passed this program to begin with. And so let's just have a more holistic and more comparative look at what program integrity is. And it's not just, did the people spend the money the way we thought they should? It's, is this program serving the public well?
Okay, that makes sense. And I'm looking forward to delving into that report. Final question, always on student service system, is what is the school choice or education myth that bothers you the most and that you want to dispel today?
I think that there are a lot, but based on the conversations that are happening right now and the way in which these programs are being administered, I think the myth that bothers me so much right now is that these programs are fraught with fraud and abuse, and they're not. Like, even in Arizona, where we handed people debit cards that had very few restrictions on them for a decade, when the Auditor General audited the program, there was very minimal misuse, less than 1%, which you're comparing that to massive government programs with huge administrations that have been around for a long time that are 10%, 18% of improper payments. And so there is major headline, like risk prevention going on here in programs and how they're operating, trying to avoid that headline that someone purchased something that maybe wasn't allowed. And it's not, like I said before, oftentimes this is not fraud. It's not fraud. Fraud has a definition in most states. And if it is fraud, guess what? It's being prosecuted. And there are consequences, and those laws already exist. So the myth that we have to regulate these programs in order for them to be sustainable, it's just not true. Again, looking at Arizona, we've had this program for over a decade, and every year they expanded it or tried to expand it, right? It didn't matter what the headlines were. If you had the right people in office supporting families, they were expanding the program. And so that's where we completely want to acknowledge, have been on the other side of this in departments and with the charter board, that there is risk there. And of course, we want to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars, but we have to also be realistic in how we're implementing. And we can't be designing these programs to prevent a headline. Opponents will always find something to create a headline about. So I think that's the myth we're trying to bust right now while we work with program administrators, is that you don't need to design your program for fear of a headline of misuse. You need to design your program to serve the families well, and families being served well are going to be happy customers and are going to help support you in your administration.
Right. And are going to ensure that the program will endure so that their additional children can benefit from it, so that their community can benefit from it. All right. Well, Whitney, thank you so much for joining me today and for all that you're doing at the Yes Every Kid Foundation to pave the way for every kid to realize their full potential.
Thanks, Jenny.
We hope listeners found today's conversation informative and encouraging. If you enjoyed this episode of Students Over Systems, please consider leaving a review on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to share this episode with your friends. To learn more about the work of the IWF Education Freedom Center, please go to iwf.org/EFC. Thank you for listening to Students Over Systems. Until next time, keep celebrating education freedom and brighter future.